So one of the biggest cringe moments for me when I speak to a client usually who hasn't spoken to their spouse yet about leaving. And I say, how do you want this divorce to go? And they say, well, it depends how they react. There's some who come and say, I don't ever want to have to speak to them again. They're a horrible person. But most of them come saying, I'd like this to go as best it can.
It was betrayal. That's a bit trickier to handle.
Well, there's a lot more, a lot stronger emotions, right? It's not the same scenario as when you just kind of drift apart and life happens. Don't shoot from the hip. Just take your time. Even if, whether it's you or your spouse who needs the time, take your time before you jump into negotiation. Well, I think it's an element of helping them build that empathy towards the other person's standpoint and see things from their perspective, but also to define some quick wins that they can achieve during that time, to give them a little bit of a sense of moving forward.
Welcome to the Just Separated podcast. Hi, I'm Karen Oman, a thanatologist, grief counselor, divorce strategist, and co-author of the Just Separated workbook. I draw on years of personal and professional experience to guide you through the challenges of your divorce. Together, with our expert guests, we'll equip you with the clarity, resilience, and tools to take charge and move forward with confidence. Follow Just Separated and join us as we explore the many different facets of divorce. Welcome to the Just Separated podcast. I'm your host, Karen Oman, and co-founder of Divorce Workshop. Today, we're going to be talking about how to negotiate with your ex when they are not engaging. And our expert guest is Chloe Oudiz. Chloe is a certified divorce coach specializing in helping international families divorce with less conflict. With 17 years working in the corporate world and a master's in law and international affairs, Chloe's support focuses on the business of divorce and helping her clients acquire the right negotiation and conflict management skills to reach agreements out of court. Welcome, Chloe, to the Just Separated podcast.
Thanks for having me, Karen.
So this topic going to hit home, especially hits home for me, but it does hit home from other people too. For my ex, he avoided, he delayed, and he would change the goalposts, which means he would move the separation agreement. You get something, no, I don't want to do that. But it doesn't always have to be that. Avoiding can be a hostile act, right? Like it can be more of a high conflict.
It is.
But for many others, it can also be that maybe they're emotionally shut down, denial, or they're fearful, right? They don't know what to do. So in your experience, how do we begin to approach negotiations when your ex isn't showing up?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. There is oftentimes an unintentional need to take that time to process, and it's not always ill-intended, especially when you see couples where the decision maker has had a lot of time to think about everything and do their research, speak to lawyers, speak to coaches, get their ducks in a row, and the other person is just playing catch up, both emotionally and logistically, in terms of getting ready. And oftentimes it's hard for the one who made the decision to pause and wait for the other because they're good to go and they want to move on, which is completely understandable. So there's definitely an element of giving the person enough time to process. And what I've seen with a lot of my clients, some of whom their ex was ill-intended, but time seems to always work in your favor in these kind of things. And ultimately they do come to the negotiation table. But I think it's about accepting that there's going to be a reasonable amount of time for them to catch up and to be ready. But then sometimes it's also their strategy. And that's a whole other way of dealing with that.
So if you're working with somebody or if they're listening to this, if they're the ones that have left, I guess we have to appreciate or understand that the person that you left does need time to catch your breath. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And the question is, how long do they need? Because, there's times where they might need a very long time because they're actually completely in denial. And in a lot of ways, not talking about the terms of your divorce is allowing them to remain in that denial stage. So it's really depending on the situation. But for some people, it can take a while, and you do have to draw a line in the sand. And at some point, you want to be able to move on. But it's acknowledging that you're giving them enough time, and enough needs to be defined, in your own context. but there needs to be some clarity around at which point it's too long and now we do need to start moving ahead. But usually that happens quite naturally because there starts being questions about the children and spending time together and logistics with regards to finances and stuff like that start to arise because you are in this kind of interim situation. And so inevitably there is a point where you're going to have to talk about how we're handling things right now in this current stage of the separation. And so that kind of forces the conversation to happen.
Yeah, because if you think about, as you said, there's some pressing issues that actually need to be talked about, right? Like you can do that interim parenting plan or whatever arrangement, but it needs, that can only go so long, right?
Exactly.
So how do you coach people who are dealing with somebody that is not coming to the table? Because
Yeah.
that's tough. I've been there, Chloe, where it's like, and I'm the one that left, and so as you said, and I really like that you said that, I had been planning for quite some time, and as a lawyer, I know, and if you know with lawyers, a lot of the times the one that has been planning is quite prepared, and the
Yeah.
other one that hasn't been planning is not quite prepared. So how do you coach someone that like me to not get so angry or
Yeah.
frustrated about that all?
Well, I think it's an element of helping them build that empathy towards the other person's standpoint and see things from their perspective, but also to define some quick wins that they can achieve during that time to give them a little bit of a sense of moving forward. So there's, all those interim arrangements are an easy, low-hanging fruit to start talking about. It's not the, decisions that are going to impact you for the next 50 years. It's really thinking short term, how do we handle things? And it gets everybody into the mood, I guess, for lack of a better word, of negotiating, of thinking of how we handle this and trying to deal with this new reality. So it forces the person who's still processing to start considering, at least in the short term, some of the consequences of this decision and realize that it is happening and that while they can control the pace, they can't control the fact that it's going to happen. So it's all part of the process. But there's people who completely refuse to engage, refuse to do a financial disclosure, refuse to speak about it. And that's where it's really difficult to start that conversation. And that's where I see a lot of my clients come to me say, I'm so sick of it. I'm just going to file because it's going to create pressure because there's a timeline from the court. And I'm, going all in because they really can't take the weight anymore. But actually, there's a lot of other approaches to bringing the other person to the table. One of them is obviously to create a carrot and some incentive for them to come and have a conversation. So if you can find a topic that is important to your soon-to-be ex, start with that one in the conversations. If they're very worried about, I don't know, I have a couple right now, they're fighting over the camper van. Who's going to keep the camper van? If that's something that's the top of their agenda because they really want to keep that camper van, start with that conversation and start having chats around things that actually engage them into the process because they care. The other thing I see a lot of people doing who are the ones trying to drive things is because they want to unlock the other person's silence, they come up with proposals. So they keep approaching them saying, what if we did it that way? What if we did it that way? And the reality is the other person can't respond to that because they're not prepared to respond to that. And so you enter into a dynamic where you've got one spouse who is bombarding the other with proposals, which could be very different from one day to the next, and the other who is already feeling overwhelmed, who is completely in alarm mode at that stage, and completely unable to process all of this information. And what's really important when that dynamic sets in, I have a lot of clients who come to me at that stage, like I'm trying to negotiate and I can't get through to them and they're going to force my hand, I'm going to have to take them to court. And really at that stage, it's about engaging the other person in the solutioning and moving out of this dynamic where you're making proposals and they're just saying yay or nay, which usually they say nay to, and trying to engage them. And so really working in a way where you're not presenting a menu of options and presenting proposals, but you're asking questions. What matters to you? What is it that you would like to do? And start with the big picture. Where do you see yourself living once we're done with this divorce? How often would you see yourself seeing the children or spending time with them? do you think you'd stay in your job, or are you considering changing jobs? If they're from another country, are you thinking that you're going to go back to your home country? Just having those conversations in a non-threatening way, because it's not a concrete number you're offering or a very specific offer. It's a conversation about what matters to them. And people like to talk about what matters to them. So it's about trying to bring them into the conversation so you can then move on to, okay, so how do we make that happen? And then it's a negotiation, it's an exchange.
Yeah, because if you think, I was listening to a big lawyer in New York, and he was saying that hurt people hurt people,
That's true.
right? So I'm thinking the person that was left, they're hurting. So if you can, and what I like what you're saying is that if you go at it as in more of a whole thing instead of just an attack thing, that these people, not the high conflict type of people, but some of these other people, they're just really hurting too,
Yeah.
right? So if you can look at it, as you said, with empathy and compassion, and also your strategy of kind of pulling them into making them feel less insecure and less, because a lot of times with these people, they can feel like their whole foundation is gone, right? Like
Yeah.
they don't know, like their whole life, their whole identity, the family is now, and so I like that you're trying, like the strategy of trying to actually connect with them in a human level too, right? Instead of just banging them with, okay, financial, you need to do this, you need, and if you don't do this, you're going to go to litigation and we're going to go to court. And that, for somebody that's in intense grief or emotionally not overwhelmed, which a lot of people are overwhelmed, it's a lot, right?
Yeah.
So and that's automatically, you want to just shut down, right?
That's what happens. That's exactly what happens. They do the ostrich strategy where they put their head in the sand. And the reality is they can't deal with those big decisions of, do I keep the house? How much of my pension am I going to give you? How much time am I spending with the kids over Christmas? All of those things feel incredibly overwhelming to anyone, but even more so if you're not ready to have those conversations. And it's just acknowledging that you can't start there with somebody who isn't ready, and that you need to ease them into the conversation and start with those bigger conversations around life as a whole and how this transition is going to happen, what you guys both want to achieve, what good looks like to both of you, etc., rather than diving right into the proposals and the actual negotiation.
Now, would you recommend, depending on who you're divorcing, right? Would you recommend they do this by email, or they do this by a meeting at coffee? Like what? I guess it's unique to every couple, right?
It really is. And it's right back to your very first comment. It depends on the person you're dealing with and the state of your relationship as well. Because in a lot of cases, there is a big amount of mistrust after that announcement. And so the person who isn't up to speed will feel vulnerable, will feel less informed, less equipped to deal with these decisions, and might feel like they're being tricked into having these conversations. So you have to tread carefully, but really only you know your spouse and how they're going to react. My advice is always conversation. And I share with my clients some conversation cards to use with their spouse. Again, if the relationship allows it. But if you can have just those human to human conversations about objectives in life, how they see their future, what they really are afraid of, what they want to avoid happening in this divorce, etc., and work through that together, get insights into what matters to them. That's actually, first of all, a huge foundation, a very good foundation for a peaceful negotiation. But it also gives you, from a strategic perspective, really good insights into what the other person cares about, what matters to them. And so once you get to the stage where you're making proposals, you can formulate those and create those based on what matters to them, and making sure that you're responding to what they care about as well as what you care about, so that you're making those proposals appealing to them and easier for them to say yes to.
Yeah, and I would also like to say a couple things is like you can, when you're going, just my advice from my end too is hold space. So when you're having those conversations, and for myself, I had been planning 8 years to leave. So I had been planning a long time. I had grieved a lot before. I had grieved during. They have not. probably, right? Even if they
Yeah.
may have had an inkling. So if they get emotional, hold space. Don't get mad. Don't run away, right? Because that breaks that as you said, that trying to get empathy and compassion, and
Yeah.
it's really a good strategy as well, correct?
Yeah, I agree. And it's actually one of the things I say in my book is, when you're making that announcement, the day you tell your spouse that you want to separate or to divorce, don't dive into the negotiation about how it's going to happen in practice. They might actually ask because they're trying to figure out what the hell this means. Don't go there. You need that time to be about them processing this news and dealing with that. They cannot be having a rational negotiation and conversation about assets and kids and stuff when their amygdala is triggered and they're right in the thick of processing this announcement. So even those who ask questions because they will try and wrap their brain around it, just don't engage in that conversation. It's absolutely fine to say, I think right now it's important for us to both acknowledge where we are and to start to come to terms with that. Let's have this conversation a little bit later, because they aren't in a state to have that chat. And even if you agreed on something, the odds are 2 days later they're going to have processed emotionally and they're going to come back to you with a completely different idea. So it's not even a win for you. It doesn't serve anybody right. So back to that space holding. Give them the time to come to terms with it, to grieve, to talk to a few people around them, and to process what's happening before you can start, having detailed chats around, logistics and stuff.
Yeah, and that's also really good advice for people that were left. So if anyone's listening, right, that you are allowed, when you hear the news, you're allowed to say to your spouse, I need time,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. The other person should respect that. Sometimes I've had people who had their spouse tell them that and who were really struggling to stick to that. And sometimes it's a good idea to say, let's have a weekly chat where we kind of start having those conversations very slowly, and we can kind of adapt the pace as I feel ready, basically, and get to that stage. But it's important to say that you need that time because the other person may not be aware of it, or they might be consciously, but not really in their way of behaving.
You know what's interesting when we were talking about this is I thought, there's not been a lot of awareness about this.
That's
When I
right.
went through my own 8 years ago, I had no idea that I should slow it down for him, and he's processing, and this isn't decades ago, right? This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
in the last decade, and so um, it's really neat that we're actually talking about this because I think it brings awareness that it's a strategy as well. It's not just this is just good advice Chloe's talking about. This is actually a really good, because if you can have a decently amicable-ish, because there's always going to be conflict, knowing these strategies you've been talking about can be really helpful for both parties.
I think it's really the key, what I see through all the clients that have come to me over the years, the ones who have a very acrimonious divorce is where the communication has stopped. And so that's really the focus with there's some who come and say, I don't ever want to have to speak to them again. They're a horrible person. But most of them come saying, I'd like this to go as best it can. And keeping that communication going is incredibly helpful and incredibly important in terms of maintaining a bit of trust, a bit of respect, and a sense that you're not going to turn on each other. And so even if it's just having a weekly coffee, whatever format is palatable to you and makes sense in your context, just keep that conversation going. Even if it's not about exactly what you want to be talking about, who's going to keep the house, just as long as there's a conversation, that alleviates the fear of the other person stabbing you in the back. It alleviates the fear that the other person isn't being truthful or honest. It just creates a connection that gives everybody a little bit more reassurance that things can go well, and they get to experience that in that connection, and it reinforces that message. So you're not just saying I want things to go well and to be amicable, you're showing. And so that communication is really, really key.
So in more challenging, so say there was betrayal,
Yeah.
that's a bit trickier to handle,
Well, there's
right?
a lot more, a lot stronger emotions, right? It's not the same scenario as when you just kind of drift apart and life happens. There will be resentment, there will be blaming, etc. I think in that kind of scenario, it's quite common actually for the one who is betrayed to be very much ready to get into the details because they think that they're going to get some kind of justice through the terms of the divorce. And in that case, I would say it's the person who has been on the wrong side, if there is such a thing, but who has been cheating or whatever, to try and be aware of the state of mind of the other person and acknowledge that things need to be slowed down and make sure that they're in the right mindset to have these conversations. And that's where processes like mediation can be really helpful, because it's a dedicated space for that conversation. You know that they're going to come in, with their head on towards that conversation as well. And so it allows them to be a little bit more comfortable in having those negotiations. But I think on both sides, as much as you don't want to be with that person anymore, the more you can create a relation with them and a mutual empathy, the more likely you are to be able to find agreements that aren't about saying, screw you, I'm going to do it my way, but really are based on trying to find the best solution for everyone.
But that's a really good business strategy.
It is a good business strategy. And that's exactly, a lot of the strategies I apply with my clients in the context of divorce come from my many years of working in mergers and acquisitions and dealing with very complex business negotiations. As much as there is a huge amount of emotion involved in divorce, the uncoupling of the emotional conversation and the negotiation is really important. And that's part of the work I do with my clients to help them really look at it as a business transaction. But you need to be emotionally ready to do that. And that's where it comes into play, that to make sure that from an emotional standpoint, you're processing, you're dealing with the feelings, and you're acknowledging how they might be interfering with your more rational brain.
Yeah, we've talked about this before on our lives, right? About the need for support, right? Like, so I often think if you think of a lawyer or mediator kind of as the surgeon, and then you have your support team around. And when you're going through something like that, you really do have to think about getting the support staff, because that support staff will help make your mediation and your litigation or lawyer, whatever, flow much easier, because you need outlets. You need help understanding why you're raging and angry, and the betrayal, and whatever betrayal there is. I mean, there's many different kinds, right? It's not just sexual or so. The team approach is really important, because then that also is a really good strategy to help get you engaged into making it a business. Because at the end of the day, and I didn't know this going through my own 8 years ago, that it's a business transaction.
And it doesn't feel that way, because of course what you're negotiating over is your children, your home, your pension. That's not business. That's your life. That's your savings, your world. But the reality is, in terms of the financial side of things, especially, it's going to be one of the biggest financial decisions you're making in your life. And you want to make sure that it's the right one for you in the long term. And a lot of people get so caught up in the heat of the moment that they're making those decisions based on now. Sometimes the now is, I want to get this over with as soon as possible, and I'll say yes to anything. Sometimes the now is, I want to get revenge and I want to get every last dime out of them. But either way, they're being driven by that very short-sighted, objective, when really the consequences and the impact of their decisions are going to be very much long-term. And that's where you want to make sure that you're strategic, that you're considered and thought through in your thinking, and that you're involving the right people. So whether it's a financial planner or a tax advisor or a pensions advisor, depending on your situation, but people who are going to bring you really back down to the facts and going to help you to get all of the data, to look at it as a transaction and treat it as such, even if from an emotional perspective it's not where you would want to be putting your effort.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you, because you are quite well known for your international divorce coaching. So is there any issues that come up international couples with this type of,
Well, there's cultural differences, and that's a big one. There's cultures where, for example, talking about money is very taboo. And so it might be that your spouse is not engaging in those financial conversations because it's not, culturally acceptable to have these conversations, or because in their culture, women, for example, don't deal with the money. And so, a woman isn't expected to be able to have these conversations. So there will definitely be, that's a very extreme example, but there will be those cultural differences. Sometimes it's just the culture of the taboo around divorce itself and how it's perceived. And it may be that one of the two is just dealing with a lot of shame and fear of judgment that the other one doesn't necessarily feel. And so that makes their journey, their emotional preparation longer than their spouses. So I see a lot of that come up, especially with regards to discussing the children arrangements and very different approaches to how, each culture or sometimes religion sees that relationship and how they envisage a healthy upbringing for the children. And usually those problems were pre-existing during the marriage, but they're exacerbated afterwards because everyone's kind of in a mode of saying, well, I'm going to do it my way now. And so it becomes a little bit more antagonized.
So what advice do you give somebody that's, is it more, what your ex is like this is their religion, this is their culture. So is it the same advice, just try to keep that some type of communication going, like the same?
It's that same preparation with regards to negotiations that requires you understanding what is important to the other person. What are their values? What is it that they're afraid of? Whose judgment are they worried about? What are their biggest fears? Understanding that, and I use an empathy map in something that I used in the business world with change management and leadership, but it's the same idea of trying to map out what are those different pillars of your ex's psyche to understand where they're coming from, and so you can position the proposals and develop them accordingly. So if they come from a background, for example, I don't know, as a child, they were incredibly poor and they've managed to make a good living and now they're comfortable, but there remains that deep-seated scar and fear of poverty and insecurity with regards to money. Then you're going to have to make sure that whatever proposals you build gives them that reassurance, that you're positioning it that way, that you're, when you're presenting it, saying, listen, I've built this, or I was thinking of this because I know this is something that's really important to you. So you really want to make sure that you can still have a lot of savings, for example. So this is how I was thinking we could do it. But having that insight is what allows you to come up with a proposal that is appealing to the other person and that allows them to comfortably say yes, because they don't feel cheated. They actually feel heard and included in the ideas.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing that came out of today's discussion, is that you have to do good negotiations, you have to understand who you're negotiating with.
And that's the hard part in divorce, because you don't necessarily like the other person on the other side of the table. But it's incredibly important. I have a whole chapter in my book where it's not a chapter, it's a sub-chapter where it says divorce isn't about you, it's actually about the other. In the context of a negotiation, your top skill is listening and understanding what matters to them, what scares them, what they care about, what are their values? Is it somebody who loves to win? Is it somebody who cares mostly about family values, or are they very religious? All of that is going to tell you what is going to be appealing to them in a negotiation and what kind of suggestions you can make that they're likely to say yes to. So you're not doing it because you're trying to accommodate them and to, provide a proposal that aligns 100% to their interests. You're doing it strategically because you want to make sure that both of you are comfortable. And if you're developing the proposal, of course it includes your interests in there, but you want to make sure that you're including theirs in understanding and hearing. And there's the added bonus that it builds trust, because they feel heard, they feel listened to, and they can tell that you are paying attention to what matters to them, not just trying to force something down their throat that suits you.
And look at the long-term goal there, right? Like if you think, I'm from a divorced family, it was high conflict in the 70s. It led to terrible anxiety in all my sister and I, because high conflict. But think about it this way, right? Like if you look long-term, you're setting up a decent foundation that is really good for your children.
Absolutely. And for yourself.
And for yourself.
One of the first things I ask my clients in the first session, I say, if you had to use one word to describe how you want this divorce process to go, what would it be? And so I give them suggestions. It could be, quick. It could be cheap. It could be conflict-free, whatever they might decide to say. But I always take note of that word, because I bring them back to that. at times where they're tempted to go off piste. You said your priority was speed. How does doing that allow you to go faster? And that becomes the barometer for a lot of the decision making throughout and a lot of the negotiation as well. If your objective is speed, knowing that a half decent proposal will allow you to move on faster might make it acceptable to you. Whereas if actually your main objective is fairness, which is another one I hear a lot, then you may say, actually, it's going to take me another 10 months to get this right, but I want to make sure we end up with something fair. So whatever that word is becomes that North Star that you're aiming at throughout all the conversations. And it allows you to make those decisions with regards to all the ideas that are going to be floated around.
Yeah, because we tend to get lost, right? Like I remember saying, "Oh, I would like fair," which is actually, in our book, it's like, what is fair? Like what they say
It's
is
very
fair
subjective.
is not exactly what you think is fair. So just putting that out there. But I'm like, I got lost. You get lost in that. So I think that's really good advice, Chloe, to say, remember that word, right? Like, because that's what you wanted, right? And if you're kind of going lost down like that angry path, or you've talked to your best friend and she's like, go get him, you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
well, that happens, right? So you kind of,
absolutely.
right? So you kind of go back. So that's brilliant. I like that.
That's the whole point really with that word, because the whole point throughout this very difficult transition is to do what's right for you. And that includes your children, of course, but for you. And you're not, and so the minute you're going off piste and you're no longer following the North Star that you instinctively came up with at the beginning, you're no longer driving your divorce. You're letting the other person drive it, because you're now responding and reacting to what they're saying and doing and losing track of what matters to you. And so you're letting them dictate the tone, the direction of the divorce. And that's when people feel like they lose complete control and they suddenly end up on a track that's not at all the one they wanted, because they've been just dealing with responding to the other person. So one of the biggest cringe moments for me when I speak to a client usually who hasn't spoken to their spouse yet about leaving, and I say, how do you want this divorce to go? And they say, well, it depends how they react. It does, but it doesn't. Of course, it takes two to tango, but you can also be very clear about how you want it to happen, and you can keep on track. That's why you need a coach and somebody to really be by your side. But if you have somebody to constantly bring you back to that path, back on track, then you're not letting the other person dictate how your divorce goes. And why would you let them decide whether it's going to be acrimonious or friendly? Don't you have a say in that? You clearly you have an objective as well. So it's really making sure that you have that clearly defined and that you're sticking to that and avoiding the reactive mode.
Yeah, which can be very common, right?
Absolutely. I did it myself during my own divorce. And, that was one of the big lessons learned, is I ended up having a divorce that wasn't the one I would have liked, because I didn't know, I hadn't defined what I was aiming at. I hadn't defined what success looked like for me. And so I was letting the other person, drive.
I think the hardest thing, though, is why we do what we do, is to help them figure out that the emotion is a huge aspect and the business part is a huge aspect. And that, as we said today, that you really need to have some type of support staff to help you understand that. Because for me, I didn't know. I felt like a fish out of water. I had no idea how to navigate any of it. And as much as we need lawyers, they're too expensive to be our therapists and our support staff.
Yeah.
They have one job, and that's the law, right? Yeah. I wish my mom had one of us when we were growing up, like when I was, and I wish, I was talking to a coach in Germany, and she said the same thing. She says, we have so much more resources for people now. Thankfully. And if you can't afford the coach, there's podcasts like yours or mine, or books like yours and mine, or Facebook support groups, which I'm leery about,
Yes,
as long as they're qualified Facebook, I'm kind of, anyways, that's another discussion, but there is resources out there for everybody, because I think if you understand what divorce actually looks like, it can really, really help you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a big element of what I do, is informing people, because I think people don't. A lot of the times, I don't see their lawyers explaining things to them either. They don't know what to expect. They don't understand the consequences. They're being asked to make micro decisions, at each point without understanding the knock-on effects of those decisions, without seeing the bigger picture. And so I'll give you an example. Your spouse isn't responding to any of the letters from your solicitor or your lawyer asking for disclosure. Like, okay, we'll file with the court. That might, yeah, okay, that is the response from a strategy perspective. Let's go ahead and file. What does that mean? Are you ready for all the knock-on effects of what that means? Have you considered them? And maybe it is the right solution, but it's about going beyond the advice that you're getting and thinking through what it means. And if you don't know, okay, if I file, it's going to take at least another year. Second of all, it's going to cost me quite a bit of money. It's going to create stress. It's going to make it harder for us to co-parent. Also, it means that I'm still negotiating. So a lot of people say, oh, we're going to file because we can negotiate. But at least in England and Wales, when you file with the court, it's only the very final hearing where the judge makes the decision for you. Every other hearing is an assisted negotiation. So you're not done with the negotiation. Plus, oftentimes they require you to go to mediation. So this idea that, oh, we'll file because that'll force them to have this conversation. No. So, it's understanding all of that. And I think that's not well explained. And people don't understand the consequences, and they tend to go blindly for whatever they're being told to do without understanding the longer term process. So information is really important. And I think that's one of the things that I really value in sharing with people, is giving them that clarity around what to expect, how it's all going to happen, what it would look like if they did X or Y, and not giving them the answer, but giving them the elements they need to find the right answer for themselves.
And also understanding it's similar in Canada too, and I think some of the states as well. But think about, like, I have heard how long court is. Like in Canada, and I've heard in the States too, it is a long wait. This is not, okay, well, we'll be in court next month, it'll all be done. No, it is years. And that's the heaviness of that. You have to also think about too, the consequences of that, because it's exhausting, right? That's a long journey to be on. So that's something that I like that you brought up, because I don't think many people understand the consequences of those actions. And as you said, some people have to do it. I mean, there's a 10, 15% that need to do that. They're high conflict type of people. But there's that 80% that are not like that, right? And that there is other ways to do it. So before we wrap up, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say also, before you jump to the conclusion that you're in those 10, 15%, it's always worth trying. Nothing can happen that would be detrimental to the future process by really giving it an honest try to have those conversations and to negotiate directly with a mediator, with whatever, lawyers in the middle, whatever would work. But you've got nothing to lose. And if you reach that point where it's very clear that it's not going to happen unless there's the real pressure of the court system, then you are in those 10, 15%. But don't assume, and do give it a try, even if it seems incredibly difficult and painful. It's still much better than the alternative. So
no, I agree. I think that the thing that I've heard over and over in these years I've been doing this is, like, everybody thinks when they're divorced, it's high conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there's a difference between
those 10, 15%.
Yeah. There's a difference between patterns of behavior that have been repetitive over the years in high conflict to just somebody that's really angry and hurt or stressed or busy at work and can't cope with everything, so not all marriages that end in divorce are high conflict, right? That's a certain percentage that are very, more have the high conflict personality disorders, right? So I just wanted to put that out there too. So is there anything we missed today about this topic that before we wrap up?
I guess just one last little nugget of wisdom. You can increase pressure over time. It's very hard to decrease it. So before you go, because they're not responding or they're not engaging, work your way up a ladder, and you can define a plan. I have a template that I work with clients to build, defining that strategy of, this is how we're going to decide, okay, this isn't working, let's try mediation. This isn't working, we're going to try arbitration. Whatever it is, that based on the information I share with them, they build that plan. But don't go straight from trying to talk to each other in the kitchen to court. There is really a ladder to go up. And if you file, it may be, again, the right solution, but it's impossible to go back down and to rebuild trust and to then try and restart that conversation once you've already shown them how high you're willing to go. So just move your way up the ladder gradually, even if it requires patience, because actually when you're trying to strong arm someone into something, it usually backfires and it really brings a lot of tension that is then very hard to get away.
I think that's even well researched about, adversity versus adversity. Once you start, it's like you're on the team of you're on your soccer team, right? And you're already against each other.
Yeah.
Right. So I think
Yeah,
that's
then
research,
it
Chloe.
becomes, well, they did that to me and they did this to me, and you don't even know who started it. It doesn't really matter at that point. And that's the whole point, is that everybody starts building a narrative that justifies their poor behavior because the other one did it first, or in their mind they did it first. And so you end up in this cycle where actually everyone feels justified in acting horribly to each other. Whereas you want to create a virtuous cycle with some positive mirroring, if you take on the proper behavior and you behave in the way that you think you should, then that's more likely to induce the same attitude of the other side. If you become aggressive, it's more likely to lead to them being aggressive.
Mm-hmm. So I ask everybody on the podcast this last question. For someone who's just separated, whether they left or were left, what advice would you give them to help them navigate those overwhelming early days? I think we kind of talked about it, but...
Yeah, I think it'd be, don't shoot from the hip. Just take your time. Even if, whether it's you or your spouse who needs the time, take your time before you jump into negotiations. I see so many people start having very detailed conversations, like literally, what percentage of the house am I going to keep, or which piece of furniture are you going to keep? Within 2 days of discussing the idea of divorcing. Take your time. Everybody needs to be at the same level emotionally, or at least close to each other. There's a lot of information to gather. There's a lot to understand about the process, about some of the misconceptions you might have about the process. There's time required to mobilize your team, make sure that you're prepared logistically as well. So just take your time. As much as I completely relate to the need to get it over with, because ultimately you're trying to get to the next chapter, acknowledge that you are wrapping up 5, 10, 20, 30 years of your life. Give it the respect it deserves and take your time to do it properly.
That's great advice. So you have a great book and you have a new program coming up. You want to tell everybody about it?
I do. So my book is called, I'll show it to you. It's called, it's mirrored. It's called Don't Screw Up Your Divorce. And the book is really targeted at people who are at that very, very early stage. Exactly what we were talking about. People who are contemplating divorce or have decided but haven't quite taken the leap yet. This is giving them all the information they need to be able to set themselves up and basically get their ducks in a row before they do anything about it. So it covers everything from paperwork you want to gather, how to choose your lawyer, how to tell your spouse, all the myths and legends about divorce as well. Trying to make sure that people fully understand. I talk about mediation, about collaborative law, all these alternatives to court, so people understand what their options are, and you can have all of that information in one place so that you're prepared. Ideally, you give it to your spouse afterwards once you've told them, and that way they're on the same page. But that's the focus of the book. The program is for people who are a step after that, who are starting the process, and it's really an end-to-end program to take them through the whole process. It's specific to England and Wales because it had to be jurisdiction specific, and it really tells people about everything they need to do from a very practical perspective, which forms to file, how you go about it, how much it costs, all of the the detail of what you need to do, but also what the law says, how assets are typically divided, how the different options to consider with regards to time for the children, the difference between having a parenting plan and a child arrangements order, all of that with my guidance and advice with regards to those mistakes to avoid, things to look out for, things to be aware of, things that you might want to document and that you might not have thought of. So it's that complete step-by-step guide to take you from start to finish for those who are trying to avoid relying entirely on a lawyer, basically, to do it for them, and who want to control the costs and keep things as peaceful as possible.
Sounds really good. And is that online?
It is. It's a hybrid program. So you purchase it online, but it includes online learning and coaching with me, and including a session with a financial advisor. So there's really that complete support. There's an ongoing weekly drop-in sessions to ask questions. The idea is that you're being guided through the whole process, and you've got someone to answer all your questions, who isn't costing you £500 an hour, and who can give you that guidance and make sure you're considering all the implications of all the different decisions you're making throughout.
And I think it's really worthwhile because I always go back to my own story, because it would have been so much better for me to have knowledge and not go in, and I don't want anybody to go through divorce blind. And that's what's been going on for a long time. So your programs and the books and this, whatever, it just helps us not, that's one of the big things we've talked about, is more awareness and that you can get through this. So
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you do one-on-one coaching all over the world, correct?
I do, because as you said, I work a lot with international families. So I have people of, all sorts of setups and all sorts of nationalities and countries and religions. So I could coach internationally. I coach in French and in English. And I have, of course, a specific expertise around the English jurisdiction, French and US. But I coach people in all kinds of settings to help them through the process.
Awesome. Well, this was a great podcast, Chloe. It was so informative and so needed. This is because this is a common thing that happens. I've had it with my own clients and my own personal life. So I'm glad we talked about this today, and thank you for coming on.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining today's discussion with our divorce expert. Check out the show notes for more about our guest. If you're finding value in our podcast, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our YouTube channel at Divorce Workshop. Share your questions, comments, or guest suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. For a comprehensive divorce guide, check out our Just Separated workbook on Amazon worldwide. This workbook covers everything from emotions and co-parenting to finances, legal insights, and recovery. A must-have for anyone navigating separation or divorce.